A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was looking at some of the security briefings coming out of Europe this week, and it feels like the mask is finally slipping. Today is March 14th, 2026, and the prompt we received from Daniel is about a fundamental shift in how we understand the current wave of global anti-Semitic violence. Specifically, the intelligence is suggesting this isn't just a series of organic, angry reactions to the news cycle, but a highly coordinated strategic operation directed straight from Tehran. We are moving from the era of spontaneous protest into the era of the state-sponsored overseas front.
It is a massive shift in the landscape, Herman. And for the record, I am Herman Poppleberry, though most of you know me as Korn. Daniel is really tapping into something that the mainstream press is still trying to frame as disconnected domestic unrest. But when you look at the intelligence reports from February 2026, the data points to something much more sinister and much more organized. We are talking about a 40% increase in coordinated online to offline threats that have direct links to Iranian state actors. This isn't just a spike in noise, it is a spike in directed kinetic potential.
That 40% figure is staggering because it suggests a level of infrastructure that most people assume does not exist for these kinds of events. We usually hear about lone wolves or spontaneous campus protests. But you are saying the intelligence services are seeing a literal hand on the tiller from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. How do they even begin to track that kind of influence in real time?
The hand is not just on the tiller, Herman. It is building the boat, launching it, and providing the GPS coordinates. The IRGC Quds force has recently updated its formal doctrine toward what they call asymmetric domestic disruption in Western nations. They have essentially realized that they do not need to win a conventional war in the Middle East if they can make the domestic cost of supporting Israel unbearable for Western governments. By opening what intelligence officials are calling an overseas front, Iran is exporting the conflict directly to the streets of London, Paris, New York, and Berlin. They are using our own cities as a secondary theater of war.
It is a chilling concept, this idea of an overseas front. It implies that Jewish communities in the diaspora are being treated as combatants in a war they did not start and are not physically part of. If we look at the evolution of Iranian proxy warfare, we usually think of Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen. Those are regional players. How does that model translate to a university campus in the United States or a synagogue in Australia? What is the actual mechanism of delivery?
It translates through a mechanism I call proxy by proxy. Iran does not necessarily need to send an agent from Tehran to spray paint a building or harass a student. That would be too easy to track. Instead, their intelligence apparatus, specifically working through Hezbollah's external security organization, which is often referred to as Unit 910, provides the targeting data. They do the doxing, they map out the locations of Jewish community leaders, and they identify the vulnerabilities of specific institutions. Then they feed that information into localized, radicalized networks that are already primed for action. These local groups think they are acting on their own initiative, but they are actually following a script written in a foreign capital.
So you are saying the local actors might not even realize they are serving a foreign state's strategic interest. They think they are just being activists or standing up for a cause, but the specific targets and the timing are being curated by a foreign intelligence service. That seems like a perfect way to maintain plausible deniability.
In many cases, the foot soldiers are useful idiots, but the financial flows tell a different story for the organizers at the top. We are seeing crypto wallets linked to the Quds force, transferring significant sums to the leadership of certain radical groups under the guise of humanitarian aid or generic advocacy. When those funds land, suddenly the logistics of these protests become much more sophisticated. You see professional-grade printing, coordinated transport for thousands of people, and digital amplification that mirrors the state-sponsored disinformation campaigns Iran has been running in the Middle East for decades. It is the industrialization of dissent.
I remember we touched on some of the mechanics of this in episode 962 when we talked about the architecture of hatred. Back then, we were looking at the ideological obsession the Iranian regime has with the Jewish state. But this feels like the kinetic realization of that ideology. It is moving from the realm of rhetoric into literal mapping and plotting. Is there evidence that they are actually planning physical attacks, or is this still primarily in the intimidation phase?
The line between intimidation and kinetic plotting is razor thin, and in early 2026, that line has been crossed multiple times. Police services in Germany and France have already disrupted several cells that were in the late stages of reconnaissance. They were not just looking at military sites. They were looking at Jewish schools, community centers, and even private residences of prominent Jewish families. This is the mapping phase of the overseas front. If you can map the human geography of a community, you can paralyze it without ever firing a shot. The fear itself becomes the weapon, and the data gathered today becomes the target list for tomorrow.
And that fear serves a very specific geopolitical goal. If Jewish populations in the West feel unsafe, they put pressure on their own governments to change their foreign policy. Those governments then start to view their relationship with Israel as a domestic security liability. It creates a wedge where the Western state has to choose between its long-standing foreign policy and its own domestic social cohesion. It is a brilliant, if demonic, way to force a strategic retreat.
You hit the nail on the head. Iran wants to make the cost of being pro-Israel too high for the average Western citizen. They are leveraging our own commitment to free speech and the right to protest against us. They use the shield of political dissent to mask what is essentially state-sponsored harassment. We saw a version of this in Ireland, which we discussed in episode 979. The uptick in incidents there was framed as a righteous defense of the oppressed, but the institutional silence regarding the sources of that radicalization was deafening. In the Ireland case, the righteousness shield was so thick that people were afraid to even point out the obvious foreign influence for fear of being called biased.
The Ireland case was a perfect example of how the righteousness shield works. When people feel they are on the right side of history, they stop asking who is providing the talking points or the funding. But the intelligence from early 2026 shows that this is not just a handful of countries, it is a global web. I am curious about the role of technology here. We know Daniel is deep into AI and automation. How is Iran using these tools to scale this overseas front? Surely they aren't just manually posting on Twitter all day.
They are using large language models to generate hyper-localized disinformation at a scale we have never seen. Imagine thousands of bots that do not just post generic slogans, but engage in nuanced debates in local community forums, using the specific slang and cultural references of a neighborhood in Brooklyn or a suburb in Paris. They can manufacture the appearance of a massive groundswell of local anger, where there is actually just a small coordinated cell and a lot of silicon. This AI-driven amplification makes the threat feel omnipresent. It makes the Jewish community feel like their neighbors have turned against them, when, in reality, it might just be a server farm in Mashhad.
That creates a feedback loop. The digital noise creates a climate of fear, which then emboldens the few real-world actors to take more aggressive actions because they believe they have the silent majority behind them. It is a sophisticated psychological operation. What I find particularly troubling is how this collapses the distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. The Iranian strategy does not seem to care about that nuance at all. In fact, they seem to be actively trying to destroy it.
Iran has never cared about that nuance, but they have been very happy to let Western academics and activists carry that water for them for years. However, when the IRGC is the one providing the targeting data for Jewish community centers, the distinction disappears entirely. You cannot claim your movement is only about the policies of the Israeli government when your tactical targets are Jewish kindergartens in a different hemisphere. The overseas front exposes the reality that for the Iranian regime, the Jewish people are the target, regardless of where they live or what their personal politics might be. They are targeting the identity, not the policy.
It is a total war mindset, and it puts Western law enforcement in a very difficult position. How do you distinguish between a student who is genuinely upset about a conflict in the Middle East and a coordinated effort by a hostile foreign power to destabilize your city? If you crack down too hard, you play into the narrative of suppression. If you don't crack down enough, the violence escalates.
It requires a level of intelligence sharing that we are only just starting to see. For a long time, local police treated these as domestic hate crimes or simple vandalism. But now, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and Europol are treating them as counterintelligence matters. They are looking for the financial signatures and the digital footprints that lead back to Tehran. When you see a protest organizer using the same encrypted communication channels as a Hezbollah operative, the domestic protest framing falls apart. We are seeing a shift where the FBI is now briefing local police chiefs on Iranian asymmetric doctrine. That is a sentence I didn't think I would be saying in 2026.
This brings up a point about our own domestic security. If Iran can turn our streets into a battlefield through these proxies, it suggests that our borders and our traditional defense systems are less relevant than we thought. The conflict is happening in the information space and the social fabric of our communities. It is a war of social erosion.
This is why the doctrine of asymmetric domestic disruption is so effective. It bypasses the military and goes straight for the psychology of the population. It is a way for a middle-sized power like Iran to punch way above its weight class by exploiting the internal divisions of its enemies. They have watched how polarized the West has become over the last decade, and they are using anti-Semitism as the ultimate wedge issue to drive those cracks deeper. They know that this specific issue triggers intense emotional responses from all sides, which makes it the perfect tool for destabilization.
I want to dig into the strategic goal of delegitimization. It seems like part of this overseas front is about making the very idea of a Jewish state or a Jewish community seem inherently provocative or dangerous. If your presence causes a riot, people eventually start blaming you for the riot rather than the people starting it. It is a form of social gaslighting on a global scale.
That is the victim-blaming dynamic that state-sponsored propaganda is very good at fostering. They want to frame Jewish existence in the West as a source of friction. If they can make the public believe that Jewish institutions are a magnet for violence, the logical next step for a fearful public is to ask those institutions to move or disappear for the sake of public safety. It is a slow-motion expulsion through social and physical intimidation. We talked about the fine line between criticism and anti-Semitism in episode 743, but what we are seeing now is that line being erased by design. When a foreign state is involved, it is no longer a debate about policy. It is a geopolitical operation.
I think we need to address the second-order effects of this. If this coordination continues to scale, what does it do to the relationship between these communities and their own governments? If a citizen feels their government cannot protect them from a foreign-directed mob, the social contract begins to unravel.
It creates a crisis of trust. If the government cannot or will not protect its citizens from state-sponsored foreign targeting, those citizens will eventually look for other ways to secure themselves. That leads to the fragmentation of society and the rise of private security, or even vigilante groups, which is exactly the kind of internal conflict Iran wants to provoke. They want the West to be so busy dealing with its own internal fires that it has no capacity to project power or influence in the Middle East. It is the ultimate distraction technique. While we are arguing about protest permits and university codes of conduct, the IRGC is moving pieces on the board.
The intelligence reports from February 2026 suggest that the mapping of these communities is nearly complete in several major cities. What happens when they move from mapping to the next phase? We have seen the precursors, but what is the end game of the overseas front?
The next phase is what they call active measures. We have already seen the precursors. Doxing campaigns that lead to people losing their jobs, coordinated harassment that forces families to move, and the occasional low-level arson or vandalism. The goal is to create a constant state of low-level conflict that wears down the target's will to resist. It is a war of attrition where the battlefield is your daily life. They want to make it so exhausting to be a vocal supporter of Israel or even a visible member of the Jewish community, that people simply opt out. They want to silence the diaspora through sheer exhaustion.
It sounds like a form of digital and social siege. You are not being bombed in the traditional sense, but your world is shrinking. You stop going to certain places, you stop wearing certain symbols, you stop speaking up. And every time you retract, the overseas front gains ground. It is a territorial conquest of the mind and the public square.
And the most effective part of the Iranian strategy is that it is self-sustaining. Once they provide the initial spark and the infrastructure, the local radicalization takes over. They have created a monster that doesn't need constant feeding from Tehran. The ideological contagion spreads through social media, fueled by the very tools Daniel and people in his industry have built. It is a tragic irony that the technology meant to connect the world is being used by a medieval-minded regime to tear it apart. They are using 21st century tools to implement a very old form of hatred.
This really reframes the whole conversation. We have spent years talking about Iranian nuclear ambitions or their ballistic missile programs, which are obviously huge threats. But this domestic disruption campaign is happening right now, in our neighborhoods, and it is arguably more effective because it is harder to stop with a traditional military response. You cannot drop a bomb on a disinformation campaign or a crypto transfer.
You have to fight it with transparency and aggressive counterintelligence. We need to stop pretending that every protest is organic. We need to follow the money and the data. When we see a massive surge in a very specific type of violence that perfectly aligns with the strategic goals of a hostile foreign power, we have to call it what it is. This is not just a domestic issue, it is a matter of national security. We need to treat the organizers of these coordinated campaigns not as activists, but as unregistered agents of a foreign power.
I think that is a vital takeaway for our listeners. Being able to distinguish between a fellow citizen who has a different political opinion and a coordinated effort by a foreign intelligence service to manipulate you is the most important skill in 2026. How can the average person start to recognize those signs of external coordination? What are the red flags?
One of the biggest red flags is the sudden appearance of highly specific, professionally produced materials that all appear at once across different cities. If the slogans in London are identical to the slogans in Sydney and Los Angeles, and they all appeared overnight with the same graphic design, you are looking at a central node of distribution. Another sign is the use of doxing and mapping. Organic protests are about expressing an opinion. State-sponsored operations are about identifying and targeting individuals. If a protest group is publishing the home addresses of private citizens, that is a signature of an intelligence operation, not a grassroots movement.
That mapping aspect is the most distinctive Iranian signature. It mirrors what they do with their cyber warfare units. They build databases of targets long before they ever intend to strike. It is a way of holding a community hostage. If we know where you live, you are less likely to speak out against us. It is the architecture of hatred in action.
It is exactly that. They are building a digital panopticon where every Jewish person feels watched and targeted. And because they use the language of social justice and anti-colonialism, they gain a level of protection from Western institutions that are terrified of appearing biased or politically incorrect. It is a brilliant, if evil, exploitation of our own values. They are using our tolerance to protect their intolerance.
It really makes you appreciate the importance of intelligence sharing between local law enforcement and international bodies. This isn't something a local police department can solve on its own. They need the context from the intelligence agencies to understand that the graffiti on a local shop is part of a global strategy directed from Tehran. They need to see the forest, not just the trees.
And we are seeing that coordination improve. The drone strike on the Nakhchivan enclave in March 2026, which we discussed in episode 1133, showed how Israel and its allies are starting to hit back at the logistical hubs of these operations. But the domestic side of the overseas front is much harder to target. It requires a resilient and informed citizenry that can see through the manipulation. You can destroy a drone factory, but it is much harder to destroy a viral lie once it has taken root in a radicalized community.
That brings us to the practical takeaways. We have talked about the intelligence and the strategy, but what can people actually do with this information? For me, the first step is a radical skepticism of news regarding protests that show signs of high-level coordination. If something looks too professional and too synchronized to be true, it probably is.
I would add that we need to demand more from our institutions. Universities and local governments need to realize that they are being used as pawns in a foreign state's geopolitical game. When they allow these coordinated targeting campaigns to happen under the guise of free speech, they are actually failing to protect the civil rights of their own citizens. We have to stop being afraid to point out where the funding and the instructions are coming from. Transparency is the best disinfectant for the overseas front.
There is also the element of digital literacy. If you are seeing content that is designed to dehumanize a specific group or that provides targeting information, you are looking at a weapon, not a post. We need to be much more aggressive about reporting and deplatforming the infrastructure of the overseas front. We have to treat digital harassment with the same seriousness as physical harassment.
This is where companies like Modal come in, providing the computational power to track and analyze these massive datasets of disinformation. We have the tools to fight back, but we need the political will to use them. We can't let the overseas front become the new normal. If we allow our domestic security to be compromised by Iranian asymmetric warfare, we have already lost the larger conflict without a single shot being fired between armies.
It really is a sobering thought. The battlefield is no longer just in the Middle East. It is in our pockets, on our screens, and on our streets. If the overseas front is the new reality of global conflict, our entire approach to domestic security has to change. We have to treat these incidents not as isolated crimes, but as components of a larger state-directed campaign. We are all on the front lines now, whether we like it or not.
It is the realization that the Levant is just one theater in a much larger war. Iran's goal is global hegemony through the destruction of the Western-led order, and they see the Jewish community as the first domino. If they can break our commitment to protecting our own citizens from foreign targeting, they have effectively neutralized the West's moral and strategic authority. They are testing our resolve, and so far, they are finding it wanting in many places.
We have covered a lot of ground today, and I think it is important to end on the fact that while this strategy is sophisticated, it is not invisible. The very fact that we are talking about these intelligence reports means that the light is being turned on. The more we understand the mechanics of the overseas front, the less effective it becomes. Sabotage only works in the dark.
Knowledge is the ultimate countermeasure. When you understand that the anger you are seeing is being manufactured and directed by a regime that hangs dissidents and suppresses its own people, the moral weight of their propaganda disappears. We just have to be brave enough to keep looking at the data, even when it is uncomfortable. We have to prioritize the truth over the narrative.
I think that is a perfect place to wrap this up. This has been a heavy one, but a necessary one. Thanks for diving into the research on this, Korn. I know you have been tracking these intelligence shifts for months, and the February data really brought it all into focus.
It is what I do, Herman. And honestly, it is the only way to make sense of the chaos we are seeing. If you assume it is all random, it is terrifying. If you realize it is a strategy, it is a problem we can solve. We just need to stay focused on the facts.
Well said. Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and help us process the kind of data we talked about today. Without that processing power, we would be just as lost as everyone else.
If you found this discussion helpful, or if it changed how you look at the news, please consider leaving us a review on your podcast app. It really does help us reach more people and counter some of the noise we are all dealing with. Every review helps us push back against the amplification of the overseas front.
You can also find us on Telegram by searching for My Weird Prompts to get notified whenever we drop a new episode or have more data to share. We will be posting some of the specific intelligence indicators we talked about today over there.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We will be back soon with more of Daniel's prompts and more deep dives into the weird world we are living in.
Stay curious, stay skeptical, and we will talk to you next time.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the flow. from slow